Friends, for our reading this morning, I'd like to share a poem by the Jamaican-born American poet, a poet of the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay. And it's a poem, I think, about befriending ourselves. It's called I Know My Soul. I plucked my soul out of its secret place and held it to the mirror of my eye. To see it like a star against the sky, a twitching body quivering in space, a spark of passion shining on my face. And I explored it to determine why this awful key to my infinity conspires to rob me of sweet joy and grace. And if the sign may not be fully read, if I can comprehend but not control, I need not gloom my days with futile dread, because I see a part and not the whole. Contemplating the strange, I'm comforted by this narcotic thought. I know my soul. So, not too long ago, I was walking through my neighborhood here in Washington when I came across some street art, some graffiti, spray painted on the side of an alley wall. It was just one sentence of white text on a black background. The text read, "It is in your self-interest to be very tender." It is in your self-interest to be very tender. I was intrigued. It's not often you see graffiti on the streets of Washington promoting virtues like tenderness. So I found myself pausing there in the middle of the sidewalk to consider what this message could mean. Tenderness is a lovely quality, but in a culture that is so often harsh and unkind, it seemed kind of naive to think of tenderness as in one's self-interest. Perhaps the author meant it in a karmic sense, as in, if you're tender to the world, then the world will be tender back to you. The more I puzzled over it, the more the phrase felt like some kind of Buddhist koan, a riddle that reveals more and more layers of meaning the longer you ponder it. I'd be curious to hear how that sentence strikes you. How is it in your self-interest to be very tender? After pondering this question for a while, I finally discovered that what it seemed to be saying to me was that the one instance in which tenderness most certainly is in our self-interest is when we are tender with ourselves and when we are gentle and kind with ourselves. And that's what my sermon is about today. It's about how we can suffer a little less by showing ourselves a little more tenderness. Let's face it, we're our own worst critics sometimes. Last week, I led a spiritual retreat for a Unitarian church in Delaware. I was teaching folks a spiritual discipline practiced by our Unitarian ancestors called meditative self-examination. It's a practice done at night before bed, where you basically take yourself on a guided meditation of your day, asking questions like, where was the sacred present in my day? Or when today did I feel most alive? What was I most grateful for? And even what or who from the day do I need to forgive? After I'd led the group through this practice, a young man raised his hand and he said, Rob, that was really hard for me, because whenever I look back on my life, I'm always filled with regret and self-judgment. I'm always critical of the choices I've made and the things I've done or not done. And I hear this all the time from people when I teach practices like mindfulness or meditation. So many of us struggle with this inner critic, with this voice inside our heads that can be so judging and self-punishing. And so I suggested to the young man that it's helpful if we can bring to our lives a kind attention, a tender attention. It's helpful if we can show ourselves a little grace and forgiveness rather than unsparing judgment. You know, the Buddha had a little teaching about this, a kind of parable that he shared with his friends and students. He said, imagine that you're walking in the woods and out of nowhere, an archer strikes you with an arrow. Would it hurt? He asked his students. Of course, they replied. And now imagine that soon after being struck by that arrow, you were struck by yet another one. Would that not hurt even more? Yes, said the students, it would. The Buddha explained, the first arrow is the pain and suffering that life sends our way. It's not something that can be avoided. We all face painful and difficult situations in our lives. But that second arrow, that's the suffering we inflict upon ourselves with how we react to our pain or misfortune, and the sometimes unhelpful stories we can tell about it. The Buddha called this the second arrow of suffering. And this suffering, this self-inflicted wound, this second arrow, this is something that we can avoid if only we were a little more compassionate and more tender with ourselves. Let me give you an example from my own life. And as I do, you may be able to think of a couple of examples from your own. So 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was riding my bike downtown and almost got hit by a taxi cab. In my effort to avoid colliding with the cab, I braked suddenly, went flying over my handlebars, landed on the street, and broke both of my arms, just below the elbows. Emily, I saw that cast on your arm earlier today. Now, in the Buddha's parable, that was the first arrow, right? Breaking my arms, the pain and misfortune that life inevitably sends our way. But it wasn't long before other arrows started raining down on me. One of them was the arrow of self-blame. I blamed myself for the accident. I said I should have been more careful. I shouldn't have braked so quickly. Why was I riding downtown in the first place? And this blaming tape would just play over and over again, adding to my suffering. In the Buddha's parable, this was the second arrow of suffering. But it didn't stop there. Arrow number 3 was my self-pity. Woe is me, I thought. Here I am in the middle of the pandemic, trying to hold a church together, trying to keep my son focused on his online schoolwork, trying to shop and make meals for my family, and now I break my arms? And not just one, but both at the same time? Really? Why do things like this happen to me all the time? Oh, that self-pity arrow, that's particularly sharp for me. The net result, of course, was that now, not only was I experiencing the unavoidable pain and inconvenience of 2 broken arms, but I was compounding that pain with the stories I was telling myself about what had happened. That suffering, those self-inflicted wounds, are the ones we can avoid, or at least reduce, by being just a little more tender with ourselves. But how do we do that? In order to minimize the suffering caused by all these second and third arrows, first we've got to realize that we're flinging them. And that's not always easy. You know, when we're in real pain, our suffering just tends to feel like this great big monolith. And it can be hard sometimes to break that suffering down into its component parts, to understand the multiple vectors of our suffering. When I broke my arms, I became really sad and depressed. And at first that seemed like a legitimate response to what had happened. But as my arms started to feel better, the depression lingered. And that's when I finally took a moment to just kind of step back and create a little distance between me and my emotions, and to notice that the bulk of my suffering wasn't coming from the arms anymore, but from those punishing stories I was telling myself. And here it's helpful not only to notice the arrows that we're flinging, to notice our unhelpful reactions and stories, but to actually go ahead and name them if we can. Give them a name. Because naming our emotions can help us get a little distance from them, to help us externalize them a little bit more, so we can hold them up and examine them. You know, look, this arrow is self-pity. Or, I see you, self-blame. I see you. One of the helpful things about noticing and naming our feelings is that we sometimes can see patterns emerge. We discover that there are arrows in our quiver that we go back to time and time again. Oh, self-pity, I know you. You're really familiar to me. Noticing these patterns can give us incredible insight into the habitual ways in which we react to misfortune and suffering, the stories we tell about it, and how we contribute to that suffering. I wonder if we, can name some of the arrows in our quiver. What are your familiar ways of responding to pain and misfortune? What are the stories you tell yourself again and again? Are they helpful? Or do they merely compound your suffering? Now, at this point in the process, friends, at this point of discovering and naming the harm that we sometimes inflict on ourselves, it's really easy to unintentionally launch yet another arrow from our quiver by beating ourselves up for the second and third arrows, right? By chastising ourselves for having added to our own suffering. Rob, you wouldn't be depressed right now if you hadn't been wallowing in your self-pity for so long. You can see how if we're not careful, the arrows just keep coming and coming. That's why at some point, we need to declare a ceasefire. Stop flinging the arrows. We need to make peace with ourselves. And this is where tenderness comes in. We can interrupt the cycle of suffering by showing ourselves a little compassion, by noticing but not judging the stories we've been telling ourselves, just noticing them with a kind attention and a compassionate heart. Oh, look how I've been blaming myself for my accident. Look how I've been feeling self-pity. Maybe I could just let those go. Rather than judge ourselves for these arrows, we can give ourselves a pat on the back for having developed the ability to notice and name them, because these tools can help us prevent future suffering. In fact, the real goal is to go all the way back to that first arrow, to the one that we didn't have any control over, and to acknowledge the pain that we suffered, and to be compassionate with ourselves about that pain. To say, yeah, Rob, it was really hard to break both arms in the middle of a pandemic. I'm sorry that happened. That's the kind of understanding and compassion that we'd show a good friend, right? Maybe we could extend that same compassion, that same tenderness to ourselves. I wonder if some of us aren't holding pain and suffering in our bodies that we never really gave ourselves the space to acknowledge, or that we never allowed ourselves to really grieve. I wonder if we can't hold these painful places in our lives with a kind and compassionate embrace. It is in your self-interest to be very tender. And the truth is that the more tender we are with ourselves, the more tender we can be with others. When we fling fewer arrows at ourselves, we're able to show up in the world in ways that can prevent other arrows from flying. Peace always begins in the heart and in the home. My husband Chris's poet friend, Juliana Spar, wrote a poem once called "Careful Now, Don't Add to Heartache." And that's the phrase that comes to my mind right now. That's what I think the Buddha was trying to say in his parable of the two arrows. Careful now, gentle now. Don't add to heartache. Don't compound the suffering. There's already more than enough out there to go around. So let's be tender and compassionate. Amen.